so much for the introduction. Welcome to today's webinar on FDA's Post-Marketing Drug Safety Compliance Program and recent inspection findings and trends from fiscal year 2019. I especially want to express my gratitude that you've taken the time to tune in today, given the ongoing public health emergency and the impact that it has on our daily lives. Towards the end of the webinar, I plan to briefly cover navigating compliance with post-marketing adverse drug experience, or PADE, reporting requirements in a pandemic situation. By the end of this webinar, I hope that you'll have enough information to identify the role of FDA's PADE compliance program in protecting public health. I also hope that you'll be able to describe recent PADE inspection findings and trends. During this webinar, I'll provide a brief overview of FDA's PADE compliance program and then focus on inspection site selection, findings, and trends from fiscal year 2019. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'll end with a brief overview of FDA's compliance expectations for adverse event reporting during the current COVID-19 pandemic. Please feel free to submit questions throughout the webinar, as we've set aside time at the end to address them. The information I'm presenting today is based on the contributions from many people. I want to acknowledge my colleagues in CDER's Office of Scientific Investigations for their dedication to the PAID compliance program, as well as their contributions in putting together this presentation. I also want to highlight the incredible work that investigators in FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs, Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations do in the field to conduct these PAID inspections and evaluate industry compliance. I'm excited that we have such a wide range of attendees, both in terms of geography and professions. I intend to cover a lot of information in this webinar and hope that it helps as you determine if you or your organization need to implement any changes to ensure compliance with PAID laws and regulations and ultimately protect public health. So let's get started. The PAID compliance program sits in CDER's Office of Compliance, whose overarching mission is to shield patients from poor quality, unsafe, and ineffective drugs and therapeutic biologics. Within our group, we focus on ensuring that companies meet post-marketing safety requirements for products that are regulated by CDER. As a result, we monitor and assess industry compliance with PAID laws and regulations. We also implement proactive compliance strategies like conducting outreach to educate the industry through activities like today's webinar. When we find companies aren't compliant, we try to work with them to bring them into compliance. However, we will take enforcement action if it's necessary. We really feel that FDA and industry share the responsibility to protect the public from dangerous and unsafe drugs and therapeutic biologics. Our compliance program is an integral part of this because it ensures that FDA has the safety information that we need to evaluate product safety profiles. To provide some context around our regulatory framework, the U.S. Congress passes laws and amendments to update the laws. Individual agencies like the FDA implement regulations that interpret the laws, and they describe who is responsible for complying, what they have to do, and how the laws will be enforced. FDA also issues guidance documents that represent our current thinking. Both laws and regulations are enforceable, and we look for compliance with these during PAID inspections. By identifying potential candidates, researching them to conduct risk assessments, and then prioritizing which firms to inspect. I'll talk a little bit more about how we select inspection sites in a few minutes. So once our team identifies the inspection sites, we notify the Office of Bioresearch Monitoring Operations, or OBIMO, in FDA's Office of Regulatory Affairs. The Office of Regulatory Affairs is the lead office for FDA field activities, including inspections. An investigator, or sometimes more than one investigator, from the BIMO program will conduct the PAID inspection. They follow the PAID compliance program, which is a publicly available document that provides instructions to FDA personnel on how to conduct PAID inspections, including which laws and regulations apply, topics and areas to cover during the inspection, and other administrative and logistic information. During the inspection, investigators assess compliance with laws and regulations by interviewing personnel, reviewing records and other documents, evaluating electronic systems, and conducting other activities that provide valuable information. If investigators observe any condition that in their judgment may constitute a violation of FDA laws or regulations, then they document it as an objectionable condition on a Form FDA 483, also called an Inspectional Observations Form or just plain 483. The 483 is issued to firm management at the end of the inspection. After receiving a 483, firms have 15 business days to voluntarily submit a written response to FDA addressing the observations. In our experience, a well-constructed written response often includes root cause analyses, corrective actions, preventative action plans, and supporting documentation. After the inspection, investigators write up an establishment inspection report describing the inspection, and they include documents and other evidence that they collected. The investigators also provide an initial classification, taking into consideration any objectionable conditions they observed and discussions that they had with management. So once the report's completed, our group in the Office of Compliance reviews it, along with the evidence collected during the inspection, the Form FDA 483 if one was issued, and the firm's written response if one was submitted. We consider the information provided in written responses when determining the final inspection classification and whether a compliance action, such as a warning letter or untitled letter, is warranted. Once we determine a final classification, we communicate the outcome to the inspected entity and document it for consideration in future risk assessments. Once we determine that an inspection is closed, FDA can release a copy of the narrative portion of the establishment inspection report to the inspected entity. So you've heard me mention inspection classifications. I want to take a minute to go through them since the inspection trends that I talk about later are based on these classifications. FDA's inspection classifications are based on objectionable conditions or practices observed on inspection that may constitute a violation of laws or regulations. Inspections are classified as having no action indicated, or NAI, when no objectionable conditions were found. It's important to note that an NAI classification doesn't mean that the firm is doing everything right. For example, an investigator may discuss one or more areas of concern with management that aren't violations of laws or regulations, but are more like best practices. In contrast, inspections classified as voluntary action indicated, or VAI, do have objectionable conditions or practices found on inspection. These inspectional observations are generally documented on a Form FDA 483, as I discussed earlier. We review the observations and look at the evidence to determine if there were any violations of FDA laws or regulations. Significant violations may result in classifying the inspection as official action indicated, or OAI. OAI classifications may result in regulatory or administrative actions. Examples of actions that we've taken in the past following paid inspections include issuing untitled letters, issuing warning letters that are posted publicly, and holding regulatory meetings. We typically issue letters because we prefer to work with firms to gain voluntary compliance. However, FDA does have other statutory options available to us, including seizures and injunctions. The next portion of my talk will focus on the role of the paid compliance program, as well as recent inspection findings and trends. The purpose of the paid compliance program is to monitor industry compliance with laws and regulations and ensure that accurate, reliable, and timely safety data is submitted to FDA and available to reviewers who use this data to evaluate product safety. For context, the paid compliance program covers multiple product types. This includes prescription and over-the-counter drugs approved under a new drug application, or NDA, as well as drugs approved under an abbreviated new drug application, or ANDA. The paid compliance program also covers therapeutic biologics that are regulated by CDER. These products are approved under a biologics license application, or BLA. Finally, the compliance program includes both prescription and non-prescription unapproved drugs. Before I get into the compliance and inspection information from fiscal year 2019, please bear with me for a few minutes as I take a step back to set the foundation. The backbone of the paid compliance program is the management of post-marketing safety information, including adverse experiences. An adverse experience is any adverse event associated with the use of a drug or biologic product in humans, whether or not it's considered product related. This is a broad definition, and it includes adverse events that occur during use in professional practice, as well as in situations of overdose, abuse, withdrawal, and lack of effect. Adverse experiences are reportable to FDA when a firm can identify a patient, a suspect drug or therapeutic biologic, an adverse experience, and a reporter. If a firm doesn't have all four data elements, they should attempt to obtain the missing information. We care a lot about post-marketing safety information because a product's safety profile may not be fully characterized at the time of approval. For example, pre-approval safety data may be limited because studies are done under controlled settings with a limited number of people exposed. It may be challenging to detect adverse events that occur outside a clearly defined study population, or adverse events that are uncommon or that occur with long-term use of a product. However, after approval, post-marketing safety data from real-world experience provides valuable information about how a product is actually used. And for unapproved drugs, the primary source of safety information is what is seen after the product's introduced to the market because they don't undergo FDA's approval process. This post-marketing information plays an important role in understanding a product's risk-benefit profile. Through the PAID compliance program, we monitor industry compliance with PAID laws and regulations to ensure that FDA gets the timely, accurate, and complete post-marketing safety information that we need to effectively monitor product safety profiles. So who do we inspect? FDA receives adverse events from the public and from industry. The main difference between the two is that the public can report adverse events voluntarily to FDA, whereas industry has mandatory reporting responsibilities. We inspect entities involved in the mandatory reporting of adverse events and post-marketing safety information for approved and unapproved prescription and over-the-counter drugs, as well as therapeutic biologics regulated by CDER. The regulatory responsibilities for these entities vary based on their role and the types of products involved. Many of the firms we inspect are application holders for approved prescription and non-prescription products. These products are marketed under NDAs, ANDAs, and BLAs. We also inspect non-applicants who are named on product labels as manufacturers, packers, or distributors. This applies to both approved and unapproved products. For therapeutic biologics, we can also inspect entities named on the product label as shared, joint, or divided manufacturers. Additionally, we can inspect retailers who are named on product labels of unapproved non-prescription drugs, often thought of as over-the-counter monograph products. Finally, with the industry trend towards outsourcing activities, we can inspect third parties like contractors, vendors, and other business entities who conduct pharmacovigilance activities on behalf of a responsible party. The responsible parties include the application holder or non-applicants named on product labels. All firms don't neatly fall into only one of these buckets, and in fact, some firms may have all of these roles given the products in their portfolio. Since the responsibilities are different, investigators assess compliance according to the inspected entity's role and the requirements for the types of products that they have. In the last slide, you heard about who we can inspect, and as you can imagine, it's a lot of firms. So when we're considering inspection candidates, we look at multiple factors and we conduct risk assessments to identify who we want to inspect that year. One of the factors we look at is information about the firm. For example, we look at recent corporate changes that may impact their pharmacovigilance systems. In our experience, mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures are areas of risks with regards to integrating safety databases and processes. Additionally, in the global environment, industry is full of partnerships and business arrangements between firms. which means that the firms need to have adequate processes in place to ensure that safety information is transferred timely, accurately, and completely. We also look at firms with multiple types of products to ensure that they're following the applicable requirements, especially since the regulatory requirements differ based on if the product is approved, unapproved, prescription, or non-prescription. Other groups within FDA and externally may also have information about individual firms that influence our considerations. The firm's product portfolio also weighs into our risk assessment. For example, new molecular entities are products that contain an active moiety that hasn't been approved by FDA before. These products are of particular interest since their safety profiles at the time of approval are largely based on controlled clinical data. Therefore, it's important that FDA reviewers have complete and timely post-marketing data in order to further understand the potential risks. We also look at products that may have a significant impact on public health. For example, the products may be high risk, associated with a wide patient exposure, or part of a safety-related recall. These products of interest may change from year to year depending on current public health situations. On an individual product level, we look at submissions made to FDA, such as individual case safety reports or ICSRs, as well as aggregate reports like annual reports or periodic safety reports. We look at these submissions to see if there are instances of non-compliance that warrant review during an inspection. Finally, as I mentioned earlier, we look at inspection history with an emphasis on firms that we've not inspected before and firms that have documented issues from previous inspections. For firms with a history of PADE violations, we review their written responses, if they submitted one, to determine if their actions adequately address the observations made during the inspection. In these cases, investigators also assess whether or not the observations were corrected during the next inspection of the firm. This figure gives you an idea of the risk assessment characteristics for firms we inspected in fiscal year 2019. I want to point out that a firm can have more than one factor weighing into its risk assessment. For example, there may be a firm that markets products of interest that has also never been inspected. Last year, over half of the firms that we selected to inspect had products of interest. For example, we selected a number of firms that held approved applications for opioid products in light of the ongoing opioid epidemic in the U.S. Other products of interest last year included new molecular entities, since they contain active moieties that FDA hasn't previously approved, and marketed unapproved prescription drugs, since they didn't go through FDA's approval process. For 44% of the sites, the fiscal year 2019 inspection was the firm's first paid inspection. We conduct thorough inspections of these firms to understand their post-marketing pharmacovigilance processes and establish a baseline for their compliance. Overall, we consider inspection histories along with other risk factors to prioritize both domestic and foreign inspection sites. Before I continue, I want you to take a moment to think about your last FDA paid inspection, or if you haven't been inspected, what your readiness level is. In the next few slides, I'll share overall findings and trends, as I mentioned in the objectives, but I'll also discuss specific examples to highlight some of the non-compliance that we've seen. If you're a regulated entity, I hope that these examples help as you evaluate your compliance with paid laws and regulations. This figure shows the final classifications for paid inspections that ended between October 1st, 2018 and September 30th, 2019. As shown in the green and yellow, the majority of inspections were classified as no action indicated, or NAI. However, when you look specifically at the yellow band, you'll see that although 56% of them were NAI, they included verbal discussions with management regarding issues that didn't violate paid laws and regulations, but still represented areas of concern. For example, investigators may have noted that firm personnel were not adequately trained, or the investigator may have identified that even though they didn't observe noncompliance, the firm's current practices don't match their written procedures. Another common discussion item that you'll hear more about in a few minutes is related to not providing adequate oversight of contractors conducting paid activities on behalf of the inspected entity. Transitioning into the orange bands, you'll see that inspections for approximately 1 out of 4 firms were classified as voluntary action indicated, or VAI, with at least one objectionable condition or practice observed during the inspection. This leads me to my next slide. This slide contains a lot of information, so I'll take just a moment to orient you to what you're looking at before discussing the individual observations. As you heard earlier, paid inspections cover a wide range of firms, like applicants, non-applicants, and contractors, as well as a variety of products, including approved and unapproved drugs and therapeutic biologics. The observations listed on the left of this slide are aggregated for all inspections completed in fiscal years 2017 through 2019, regardless of the firm type or products covered during the inspection. On the right side of the slide, the bars reflect data from the past 3 fiscal years. The orange bars correspond to data from fiscal year 2019. As a reminder, all of the information that I'll discuss on this slide is related to inspections that were classified as VAI. In fiscal year 2019, the top 3 observations were each documented in roughly 1 out of 5 firms. Observations related to these 3 topics have consistently been the most frequently cited in paid inspections over the past 3 years, so I'll go through each of these in more detail. The most common was a failure to submit aggregate reports to FDA on time or at all. FDA requires application holders to submit 2 different types of aggregate reports: annual reports and periodic safety reports. Annual reports are a summary of clinical information that the applicant has to submit every year within 60 days of the U.S. approval date. In contrast, periodic safety reports specifically summarize post-marketing safety information and include the Periodic Adverse Drug Experience Report, or PADE for drugs, and the Periodic Adverse Experience Report, or PAYER for biologics. FDA also grants waivers allowing firms to submit periodic safety information in the Periodic Benefit Risk Evaluation Report, or PBRER format. The PBRER is a common standard for reporting that follows ICH guidelines. Regardless of the format, FDA requires firms to submit periodic safety reports quarterly for the first 3 years and annually after that, unless FDA notifies the firm of a different schedule. The quarterly reports are due within 30 days of the close of the quarter, and the annual reports are due within 60 days of the U.S. approval date. This observation captures several situations of noncompliance. Firms failed to submit one or both of the reports to FDA on time for a variety of different reasons. In some situations, we inspected firms who didn't recognize that the annual reports and the periodic safety reports are 2 different submissions under different regulations. We've seen firms assume that these 2 reports are the same, especially when both are on an annual schedule. Consequently, they may only submit one of the reports, or they may incorrectly combine information into a single report. We've also seen firms incorrectly submit the periodic safety report as an attachment or appendix to the annual report. Additionally, we've observed firms that failed to submit these reports for their approved products that weren't being actively marketed in the U.S. It's important to note that all paid laws and regulations, including those for aggregate report submissions, apply to any approved drug or therapeutic biologic, regardless of their marketing status. And as a reminder, a product is considered approved until it's officially withdrawn in the Federal Register. Moving down the list, noncompliance with submitting ICSRs remains a concern over the past 3 years. An ICSR describes an adverse event related to an individual patient or subject. Firms are required to submit initial and follow-up reports of certain adverse events to FDA in an expedited manner, and the timelines for submission depend on the firm's role, the type of product, and the source of the adverse event information. Expedited ICSRs are due to FDA within 15 days of receipt of the information. For approved products and unapproved prescription drugs, firms have 15 calendar days to submit expedited ICSRs to FDA. Whereas for unapproved non-prescription drugs, also thought of as the OTC monograph products, firms have 15 business days to submit the expedited ICSRs. Certain non-applicants named on product labels have a choice to either comply with the requirements I just mentioned or they can choose to submit all serious adverse events to the applicant within 5 calendar days. During inspections, investigators take the firm's role into consideration when assessing compliance with the expedited ICSR reporting practices. In fiscal year 2019, of the firms that had a final inspection classification of VAI, we noted that approximately 1 in 5 failed to submit expedited ICSRs on time or at all to FDA. Expedited ICSRs include serious and new safety information that FDA relies on to monitor product safety profiles. Firms that have approved drugs and therapeutic biologics are also required to submit non-expedited ICSRs to FDA. Non-expedited ICSRs generally include known or non-serious safety information. Firms can submit non-expedited ICSRs on or before the due date of the corresponding periodic safety report. In fiscal year 2019, of the firms that had a final inspection classification of VAI, we noted that approximately 1 in 10 failed to submit non-expedited ICSRs on time or at all to FDA. We also observed that 14% of the firms submitted incomplete ICSRs or aggregate reports. FDA relies on the submission of timely, accurate, and complete information to evaluate the safety profiles and determine if any necessary actions need to be taken, such as changing the product label or communicating with the public. The last objectionable condition I want to discuss relates to having inadequate written procedures for the surveillance, receipt, evaluation, and reporting of post-marketing adverse experiences to FDA. Written procedures are required for all approved drugs, whether they are prescription or over-the-counter, as well as for therapeutic biologics and unapproved prescription drugs. I specifically want to highlight this for your attention, since we've issued a number of warning letters for a failure to develop adequate written procedures in the past. You'll recall from the previous slide that most of the observations were related to the inadequate reporting of post-marketing safety information to FDA. But this is essentially just the result of an entire process. Non-compliance at any stage along the process may ultimately result in a failure to report timely, accurate, and complete safety information to FDA. The actual systems that individual firms implement can vary, but we've seen that not having an adequate process in place to manage post-marketing safety information can lead to non-compliance, inspectional observations, and even being on the receiving end of a compliance action, like getting a warning letter. We've noticed that it's a common business practice for firms to outsource activities related to the surveillance, receipt, evaluation, and reporting of post-marketing safety information. While any part of the process may be contracted out, paid laws and regulations don't allow for the transfer of responsibilities. The main thing that we've seen come up during inspections is a failure to maintain oversight of activities being conducted on the responsible party's behalf. So if a contractor or vendor falls out of compliance, the regulatory consequences may fall back on the responsible firm. In the past, we've seen firms who rely only on their contractors for compliance receive inspectional observations and warning letters. Okay, so let's start with surveillance. FDA requires firms to monitor for adverse events that may come in through any source, whether it's foreign or domestic. This includes spontaneous sources like consumers and healthcare professionals, as well as solicited sources like clinical trials and patient registries. It's important to note that this applies to all parts of the firm and not just the pharmacovigilance department. For example, we've seen situations where the pharmacovigilance group is unaware that the commercial group initiated a marketing program or internet presence that may be a source of adverse events. We've also seen situations where the product quality group fails to identify or transfer complaints containing adverse events to the pharmacovigilance group. Or we've seen situations where emails containing adverse events are routed to people no longer employed at the firm. And more recently, we're seeing issues with the management of safety data between business partners. The trend for industry to jointly develop and market products means more than one firm's information may be on the label, or that the firm marketing the product may not hold the safety database. Business partner relationships vary widely, so clear written agreements are important to establishing roles and responsibilities, as well as addressing the transfer, documentation, and reconciliation of safety information. Once adverse event information is received, the firm has to document the date of awareness, since that determines when the report is due to FDA. And this applies to the initial report as well as any follow-up information that's obtained. On inspection, we've seen that a common cause for late reporting is failing to appropriately document the receipt date when anyone at the company or anyone acting on the company's behalf was made aware of the information. All adverse events that are received must then be evaluated to determine how the report should be submitted to FDA and if any follow-up is needed. This includes evaluating three main factors that impact how adverse events get reported. The first factor is determining if any serious outcomes were reported. One error that we've seen firms make is that they may evaluate the severity of an adverse event instead of the seriousness. Seriousness is an outcome of an adverse event, and it's defined in PADE laws and regulations. This includes outcomes like death, hospitalization, a life-threatening experience, persistent or significant disability, a congenital anomaly or birth defect, or another important medical event. The second factor is evaluating if the reported events are described in the current U.S. product label. If the adverse event is not in the currently approved U.S. product label, it's considered unexpected. Events that are more severe or more specific than what's described in the label are also considered unexpected. It's important to make sure that the evaluation is being made on the current product label, especially since safety information may change over a product's life cycle. Finally, for adverse events from solicited sources, firms must assess if the event is possibly related to the drug or therapeutic biologic. We've seen situations where firms fail to make this assessment, resulting in incorrectly classifying the adverse event and subsequently reporting it incorrectly to FDA. Based on the product type and the firm's role, these evaluations are critical in determining when and how the firm has to report adverse event information to FDA. Finally, firms must correctly and completely submit safety information to FDA electronically in a format that FDA can receive, process, and archive. This applies to aggregate reports as well as expedited and non-expedited ICSRs. The annual reports and the descriptive portion of the periodic safety reports are submitted to the Electronic Common Technical Document, or ECTD, via the Electronic Submission Gateway. However, ICSRs are not submitted to ECTD. We've seen firms incorrectly submit ICSRs as PDF attachments to the periodic safety report. In order to submit ICSRs, firms must have an account with FDA to submit via one of two acceptable electronic methods. The first option is to submit E2B data elements in XML format via the Electronic Submission Gateway. This is a database-to-database transfer of ICSR fields from the firm's safety database to FDA's Adverse Event Reporting System database, also known as FAERS. The second option is to submit via FDA's Safety Reporting Portal. The Safety Reporting Portal provides a web form where firms can manually enter ICSR information, which is then sent directly to FAERS. As you heard earlier, failure to submit timely, accurate, and complete reports, or failure to submit reports in the appropriate electronic format, can result in inspectional observations and compliance actions. So although this section of the webinar is not related to paid inspection findings or trends, given everything going on around the world today with the COVID-19 pandemic, I want to end by addressing the current situation that we find ourselves in and how it relates to compliance with paid laws and regulations. Shortly after the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 a pandemic, FDA issued a final guidance that reflects our current thinking related to post-marketing adverse event reporting for medical products and dietary supplements during a pandemic. We recognize that the current situation may impact industry's ability to function normally, including maintaining compliance with regulatory requirements that are related to post-marketing safety activities. We also understand that during a pandemic, there may be a reduced workforce, while at the same time, there may be an increase in adverse event reporting for products used to manage the pandemic. The guidance referenced on this slide describes FDA's intended approach to enforcing adverse event reporting requirements during the pandemic. In the next few minutes, I'll cover a few points at a very high level, so I strongly recommend referring to the guidance to understand how it applies to your specific situation. So I know we're past the before timeframe for this pandemic, but it's not too late. Planning and preparing for the potential impact on your ability to comply with paid reporting requirements is still a valuable step to take. Consider developing a continuity of operations plan, or COOP, to ensure that operations can continue for all stages of the pandemic. The COOP plan should include things like instructions for reporting adverse events to FDA and a plan for how to handle reports that weren't submitted within the regulatory timeframes. As you develop your COOP, consider the potential impact the pandemic may have across your entire organization in terms of adverse event reporting. For example, you may want to consider things like what activities are directly relevant to processing and submitting mandatory adverse event reports to FDA, and how would sites based in the US and abroad be affected differently. Additionally, you may want to consider what activities occur at each site and what the relative resources required are. Developing and preparing to implement the COOP is important in case you can't fulfill all adverse event reporting requirements because of pandemic-related factors, like high employee absenteeism. During the pandemic, FDA may communicate with firms if there are products or issues that present special concerns, like newly emerging safety issues or product problems associated with adverse events. In these situations, FDA expects firms to comply with paid regulatory requirements and submit post-marketing adverse event reports to FDA on time. In general, FDA expects firms to maintain required adverse event reporting processes to the maximum extent possible. In other words, if you're able to maintain compliance with paid regulatory requirements, the expectation is that you do that. However, if you're unable to follow your adverse event reporting processes and maintain compliance with paid regulatory requirements, then you should implement your COOP. If this happens, you should maintain documentation of when the pandemic was declared and when it ends. It's also important to document what factors are preventing you from meeting your regulatory obligations. This includes factors like high employee absenteeism and increased adverse event reporting. As soon as it's practical, notify FDA of the conditions impacting your ability to comply with the regulatory requirements. The guidance describes reporting recommendations based on the type of product, the type of report, and the firm's situation. This includes information about prioritizing the order of certain submissions, like 15-day alert reports may have priority over periodic reports. It also includes information about what types of reports may be stored, if necessary, for submission after the pandemic is over and adverse event reporting processes are restored to their pre-pandemic state. If this occurs, you should maintain records to identify what's been stored and when processes were restored. During a pandemic, all firms are strongly encouraged to submit as many required reports as possible in order to minimize the reporting burden once adverse event reporting processes are restored to their pre-pandemic state. FDA expects firms to resume fulfilling all paid regulatory reporting requirements after the pandemic ends and adverse event reporting processes have been restored. This includes submitting new adverse event reports as well as reports that were stored due to the pandemic. FDA expects firms to prioritize and submit stored reports within 6 months of restoring adverse event reporting processes. If you find your organization is impacted by the pandemic, I urge you to review the guidance for more detailed information. So with that, I hope I've given you an understanding of FDA's paid compliance program and the important role that it plays in ensuring the safety of products available to the public. For additional information, please visit FDA's Post-Marketing Adverse Event Reporting Compliance Program website at the link provided on this slide. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that you stay safe through our current situation. That wraps up our presentation portion of today's webinar. Please stay tuned as we take a brief break to look at the questions that came in, and I'll be right back with answers for you. Thank you so much for the introduction. Welcome to today's webinar on FDA's My apologies again for the technical issues we experienced earlier and for staying on past the 2 o'clock time frame for the question and answer portion. I'll try to answer as many questions as I can that came in during the webinar. So we got a question about, a number of questions about the pandemic. A lot of them are around considering the pandemic situation. Is FDA planning to conduct remote inspections? Are we considering a risk-based approach for the inspections? Are we doing inspections during the pandemic or postponing them? So I kind of want to lump them all together and address them in one. So most of the paid inspections are considered routine surveillance inspections, and then due to the COVID-19 pandemic, routine surveillance inspections in support of the Bio-Research Monitoring Program are currently postponed. So we're prioritizing the postponed inspections for completion once the travel restrictions are lifted. So moving on to the next question is, who in FDA confirms contact for clarifications on specific situations on reporting adverse events to FDA, as well as seeking clarifications on regulations and guidances, as well as where do we notify FDA about pandemic-related questions? The answer to both of these and the general contact for if you have any questions related to compliance for paid laws and regulations is to contact our team, the Pharmacovigilance Compliance Team in CDER's Office of Compliance. Our email address is listed on the slide, and it's CDER, CDER-OSI-ADE at fda.hhs.gov. So let me move down to the next question. It was related to the possibility, there's a number of questions about missing the 15-day deadline for written responses or not providing written responses to a Form 483. We also had questions around the implications for not submitting acceptable corrective actions to VAI inspection findings. So in general, we look at all of the information from an inspection in totality. So that includes the establishment inspection report from the investigator, the 483 that was issued, as well as any supporting evidence. And we also look at the firm's written responses. So we review and we consider the written responses that we receive within 15 business days of the inspection close when we determine the final outcome of the inspection. And this outcome includes things like whether or not we need to take a compliance action, like issuing a warning letter. So you can still submit a written response to a 483 after the 15 business days, but we won't delay our review of the written response or any potential compliance actions in order to incorporate the late response. So those written responses really are your opportunity to provide your impression, your feedback, and your perspective on the observation to a 483, and we'll consider that when we review the totality of the information surrounding your inspection. Okay, we have another question about someone's asking about they've discontinued marketing the product and it's not being marketed currently. Do they still need to submit the full scientific literature in an ICSR and the product is an ANDA or an ANDA? So if you're the applicant for any approved drugs, then you have to comply with all paid laws and regulations that apply, and this includes the submission of ICSRs and aggregate safety reports. So the regulations are based on product approval and not product marketing status. So to answer the question, you still need to submit any serious and unexpected adverse events that you're aware of from the literature to FDA's 15-day alert reports.
And this isn't directly related to the question, but one thing that we've seen firms do incorrectly, specifically related to literature reports, is that they exclude cases if they decide their product is not causally related, or if the article doesn't specifically name them as a manufacturer. So I just want to take the opportunity to reiterate that the regulations related to reporting adverse events from the literature, they don't provide for exclusions based on causality, manufacturer, formulation, or anything like that. We have a really good question that we've heard before about observations related to having inadequate written procedures. And there's a couple questions about what's the definition of inadequate written procedures, what were the most common missing SOPs or ones that typically had insufficiencies. So it's really hard to list all the ways that written procedures could possibly be inadequate, especially since each firm's structure, their operations, their pharmacovigilance processes, they can vary. So instead, I think it's helpful to think about what your written procedures need to accomplish. So they need to demonstrate that you have processes in place to maintain compliance with your regulatory obligations, and that you include enough detail and accuracy in them to ensure that your post-marketing safety operations are in a state of control. So during an FDA inspection, the investigators determine if your post-marketing safety operations are in a state of control by referencing the applicable regulations against your written procedures and reviewing supporting records and documents and communications and talking to people at your firm to verify that. So we've seen that not having adequate written procedures in place can result in getting inspection observations and compliance actions like warning letters. And the non-compliance can be related to the written procedure itself, or they can relate to a broader concept where they don't adequately address the surveillance, receipt, evaluation, and reporting of post-marketing adverse events, kind of related to that slide about the PADE process. So those steps are an important part of being described in your written procedures. Not having adequate written procedures can also result in other non-compliance. So the written procedure may be a root cause for things like missing adverse events because you don't account for all possible sources, or late reporting, or failing to evaluate adverse events. We've also seen written procedures be related to non-compliance for not reporting adverse events to FDA in an acceptable electronic format. For example, FDA does not accept paper submissions anymore. They need to be reported electronically, as I mentioned during the presentation. So obviously this isn't an exhaustive list of possible non-compliance related to written procedures, but I did want to give you some examples just to underscore how important it is to have written procedures in place so that you can ensure that you're maintaining compliance with the PADE laws and regulations. So I'll just take just another moment to pick up some more questions that have come in. So there's a question about if the firm meets fully the FDA requirements for reporting on time during the COVID-19 pandemic, is it still required for a firm to develop a COOP? So the COOP is not a requirement. It's in guidance. It's a suggestion that you develop it in order to prepare yourself for if you encounter the scenario where you cannot meet your regulatory obligations. So I would refer you back to the guidance for examples of what needs to be addressed and what types of planning may apply to your firm and the type of reports that you may get and need to report. So I would point you back to the guidance. There's a number of questions about that. You can download the slides. The guidance link and title is available in the slides. So I do recommend reading that. Okay. So there was a question about how should we ensure adverse events received from social media are handled and reported. So social media is a source of adverse events for firms. We hold you accountable for the social media that you sponsor. So this could be Facebook pages, Twitter handles, Instagrams that are sponsored by your firm. And so you need to account for the receipt of adverse events from these sources and then have a procedure in place to document the receipt, evaluate it, determine if it needs to be reported, and then report it to FDA. Another part of the social media that has come up before on inspection is the need to retain records. So for example, maintaining a link to a social media post, like a Facebook post, we've seen those links go dead. And so at that point, you don't have the actual raw data that was related to that adverse event. So just to be conscious about what you're retaining as far as records from social media as well. Another question is related to, are separate pharmacovigilance agreements required between a product applicant and a third-party manufacturer if the manufacturer is listed on the labeling? Or can adverse event exchange be outlined within a quality technical agreement? So to us, it doesn't really matter what you call the agreement. It really needs to address the roles and responsibilities that you're delineating between the two firms, as well as the documentation, the transfer, the receipt, the reconciliation of adverse events and safety information. So it needs to fall into that overall process around the surveillance, receipt, evaluation, and reporting of adverse events, and ensure that anybody doing anything on your behalf, if you're the applicant holder or non-applicant named on the label who's responsible, that these other parties are providing you information so that you can maintain compliance with the regulations. There's another question about, can I clarify if an expedited ICSR means that at least a reasonable causal relationship is suspected between medicinal products and an adverse drug experience? So the causal relationship in terms of what needs to be reported to FDA only comes into effect for the adverse events that come from solicited sources or study sources. And so for all spontaneous adverse events, the expedited reports are any serious and unexpected adverse event. However, when you have an adverse event from a solicited source, like a study or some other organized data collection scheme, there's an additional evaluation that takes place, and you only report them as expedited ICSRs if you determine there's a possible causal relationship. Okay. So there's a couple of questions around the aggregate reports. For aggregate reports, are you receiving PADERs or are applicants doing PSURs, as well as does FDA provide any specific format for a PADER? So as far as the PADERs are concerned, the format, the content, and the reporting timeframes are all spelled out under 21 CFR 314.80. And so those are the regulations that we would inspect against. However, FDA does grant waivers to firms for submission in alternative formats, like the PBRER format that I mentioned during the presentation. In those, with a waiver, firms can submit in those formats. However, the timeframes are still the ones that are in the regulations. So I would refer back to 21 CFR 314.80 for the format and the content of the PADER. Let's see. There's a question about, does FDA take into consideration other agency inspections, such as ASNM or MHRA, before deciding to inspect the U.S. in the U.S.? So we take into consideration any information we get. It all weighs into our risk assessment when we consider which inspections we want to issue, the whole site selection process that we undertake. And so we do have agreements in place to share information with other foreign regulatory agencies, so information that they may have may inform it. And there was another question related to this about whether or not we have mutual reliance or we do joint inspections. So currently for pharmacovigilance, we don't do joint inspections, but as I mentioned, we do share information. We do observe inspections in other countries, and other countries may observe inspections here. So even though there's no formal mutual recognition program for pharmacovigilance, there is information exchange that occurs. There's another question about, have you ever inspected specialty pharmacies? So we can inspect various components of the entities involved in PAID or pharmacovigilance in general. And so that includes specialty pharmacies if they are conducting activities on the behalf of an applicant or a non-applicant named on a label. So it is possible to inspect specialty pharmacies and review how they handle adverse events, but the receipt, the evaluation, the reporting, the agreements they may have with the applicant holders or the non-applicants named on the labels. And they do fall under the jurisdiction of a paid inspection if we again, through our risk-based inspection site selection through our analysis if we decide that we need to go to one. In a related vein, many firms have their pharmacovigilance activities outside the U.S. Do you do international pharmacovigilance inspections of vendors? It's the same idea. Again, vendors or third-party contractors, we can inspect them, and we treat what they do on behalf of the applicant or the non-applicant named on the label. We look at the agreements that are in place, the activities that they're doing, whether or not they're in compliance. So even in a broader context, as I mentioned on the slides, we hold the applicant holders and the non-applicants named on product labels accountable because of our regulations. However, we can look at contractors, third-party vendors, business affiliates, and entities who do pharmacovigilance activities on behalf of a responsible party. And I'll just take just a moment to take one last question. Let me just take a look at what's come in the last few minutes. So there's a question about how many days it takes for us to get our EIR letters, and it depends. Investigators write up the EIRs after they get back to their offices, and their workloads are impacted by situations like the current pandemic or the need to immediately go on another inspection. Additionally, we send the EIR letter after the pharmacovigilance compliance team determines a final classification, which includes an analysis of all the documents I've mentioned, the EIR, the evidence collected during inspection, the 483, the firm's response. So I understand the interest in getting the letter and a copy of the EIR, but I also ask for your patience as we manage the competing demands that we have. I want to point out that all of the paid inspections end with a closeout meeting, and this meeting should give you an idea of where to concentrate your corrective actions, even before you receive a formal communication from FDA. So that's the last question. I think we've run out of time, even the extended time. So if you want to contact our team and you have additional questions or you need clarifications, please email us at the website listed on this slide. Again, that's ceder-osi-ade@fda.hhs.gov. I want to thank you all again for your attention today, and I will turn it back over to Brenda to wrap up the webinar.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Kothary. What an excellent session. Very informative and timely talk, and thank you for also responding to the questions. Of course, it goes without saying, thank you to our audience for staying with us and recuperating so quickly with the Adobe Connect challenge that we had, the connectivity issue that we had. So it was indeed a delight to work with everyone. A few closing reminders. The webinar is offering 1 continuing education credit to physicians, pharmacists, and nurses, and FDA will mail participants a code with instructions on how to claim credit after the webinar. You have 2 weeks in which to claim that credit, no exceptions. This activity is also eligible for continuing education by SOCRA, RAPS, SQA, and ACRP. Please refer to our website for additional details. You will be able to obtain this attendance certificate only upon completion of the survey, which will remain open for 2 weeks. In this case, that takes us to May 13th. Let us know of your comments and feedbacks via the survey. And on behalf of CDER Small Business and Industry Assistance, we hope that you enjoyed today's presentation and found it helpful. We apologize for the challenge that we had, and thank you for bearing with us through it. We look forward to your presence at future webinars, which will be advertised on our website at www.fda.gov/CDER SBIA webinars with an S on the end. Thank you, and stay safe and healthy, everyone.